Highway 61 Revisited factors heavily into Bob Dylan's undisputed place in the pantheon of pop music history. But that's not to say he wasn't already a well-known name by the middle of the 1960s. By that time, he had been dubbed the spokesman for his generation. Just the month before Highway came out, Dylan shocked the Newport Folk Festival by introducing an electric guitar to his set. Much of the ambiguity revolving around Bob Dylan's actual role in the time period is related to the fact that rock and roll was still defining itself, much like the youth of that era. Here's part 2 of my discussion with another Bob, with a short appearance by his wife, my impromptu guests this fall at Defiant Records and Craft Beer in Laconia, New Hampshire.
And for everybody even half listening, this is, we're already 15 minutes into a great conversation about Bob Dylan and his status in society. So this album came out in
65.
Yeah. And do you think that that's right in the middle of the decade, right in the middle. And
it predates like the hippie movement, for instance.
Yeah, so many, like myself included, because I wasn't born anywhere near. I was born 81, and my parents lived through the 60s. So I remember, like when we had Throwback the Clock Day at school, we would we'd be like, "We're the 60s, so let's all dress like hippies." And my parents were like, "We didn't know any hippies." And they went to college in New York City, and they didn't know a single. They said, "We know one girl that dressed like that," and that was about it. It didn't really, that fashion didn't really show up until the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, but. The 60s are, I always kind of depict them in my head as being like, the first couple of years of the 60s just overlap with the 50s. That prosperity, the optimism, pre-Vietnam.
Yes.
Vietnam sinks in, and, by the end of the decade, you have, the president of the United States had been killed. His brother's been killed. Martin Luther King Jr. has been killed.
The Cold War is in full effect.
And it's getting scarier by the day. It's Lyndon Johnson spending far more money on Vietnam than on domestic issues.
And we're bombing Cambodia.
And Nixon came in and he promised to end it all, but then it just continued on. And so it's talking about maturing. The 60s, it was almost like the reverse of the month of March. It came in like a lamb and left like a lion.
Absolutely.
And here it is right in the middle. Highway 61, do you think that that's an actual highway number, or is that 1961?
I think it's more metaphorical, I guess I would say. Right? It's just, I don't think it's relating to anything in particular in real life, like something historic or anything like that. I don't think so.
So I just think of, I think of like the U.S. highways, like Route 66.
Route 66
like,
is the big one.
For some reason, every time whenever I see this title, I read it wrong as Route 60, Highway 66, and I think how many songs are written about the road and the road experience. You mentioned the Beatniks. I think about Jack Kerouac. On the road. I feel like this would be like a good, reading that book and have this on in the background. They kind of one of the same group of things.
There's a lot of shared DNA there.
I think that the 60s, if you want the real version of the 60s, or any decade, just dip right into the middle. Right? 65, 75, 85, 95.
Certainly through the 60s, I would even say to 2000, right? There's a very easy line of demarcation because things seemed to change at the time. Like Woodstock came, and that was kind of the pinnacle of the hippie movement.
Right.
But then the 70s kind of coming, of course, disco and all that. But then the 80s hit, like right at that time, everything changed, like 1980. Now all of a sudden, everything's very electronic with the music, And of course, 90s, what happens? Grunge hits. And then after that, it kind of all jumbles together. Things start happening like radio doesn't have the influence it used to have, and so things get very compartmentalized.
It's funny because you go through all the categories in the record stacks in front of us, and I would say that probably in the 60s, those categories wouldn't exist. It would just be like blues, jazz, and
soundtracks. Because remember, musicals were very big.
Yeah, that would be. And actually, I think I have the Graduate soundtrack here.
So that's a good one.
Kind of a combination also of it. It says something about. Because I always get not upset, but I teach a pop culture class at school, and it starts with the 70s and goes to the present.
Yeah.
And when I have them, I'm like, choose, something, a primary source, a movie, a song, an album, TV show from the decade. Whenever they hug the early parts of the decade, I'm like, that's not quite what we're looking for, because 80, 81, that's still the 70s influencing that. The
Absolutely.
80s, plural, hadn't happened yet.
Nope.
I think really the only decade in recent memory that would be inspired by the future would be the 90s.
Yeah.
Because we were looking forward to the 2000s and, all
definitely.
But other than that, it's always like, I was watching E.T. with my son last night, and even though that movie came out in 1982, these are 70s kids. I mean, they're not 80s kids. They're still, listening to the music and the fashions and the game. They're playing Dungeons and Dragons. That's all 70s culture.
That is, and it's funny because E.T. I'm the same age as the kid who plays Elliot in E.T. So I'm
Henry Thomas.
I'm 1970, and so that was totally my life in 1982 when E.T. came out, playing Dungeons and Dragons, and all that stuff. But you're right, it was still influenced by the 70s, of course. Like even the bands that were big at that time, where Pink Floyd was huge. Zeppelin maybe not so much because John Bonham had died at that point, and we were waiting for something else to happen.
Right.
They kind of called it quits. But still, the biggest bands at the time were still those. Classic rock hadn't been a term yet, so these were still like the big bands from the 70s were still kind of reigning up until about 82, when I think new wave kind of took over, and it was kind of a reaction to that, and everything became very electronic, keyboard kind of driven.
A lot more futuristic.
Futuristic.
They were trying to incorporate those sounds a little bit more.
Even in jazz, like a good example is Herbie Hancock comes out, one of the, Prodigy, straight up kind of jazz. But by 1980, he's doing Rocket, which is a total electronic, composed song, and an MTV hit to boot for Herbie Hancock, who played with Miles Davis.
It's crazy how that overlaps like that. I remember going back to when I was first student teaching, and I was doing a lesson on the Civil War, and my supervisor was present, and he was an older gentleman, and kind of midway through, he kind of raised his hand. He's like, just not for nothing, but he's like, the Civil War wasn't that long ago. He's like, when I was a little boy, I met my great-grandfather, and he was a Civil War veteran. He's like, we're not that far removed. And pop music even more so. Like, we kind of think of 100 years ago, the 1920s, as being 100 years ago. But when we were younger, it wasn't that weird to have people that were not only alive, but alive and well in the 20s and contributing to the culture. And that's the birthplace of mass media, is the 20s. Bringing that to, and kind of carrying it with us, and to have, somebody who is right there with Miles Davis is,
and now he's on MTV.
And and now MTV doesn't even show music, I don't think.
No, I don't think so either.
It's all just teenage pregnancy, and
it is funny how things change, right? I mean, that was the most in my childhood, which is the 80s again. That was the most influential thing going. I can remember running home from the school bus for Michael Jackson's Thriller to premiere, because it premiered at like 4 o'clock or something like that.
I was just saying to somebody the other day how terrified of that video I was as a kid, because I was really young, and because it was MTV has never paid for a video. And Michael Jackson, we think of him as multi-billionaire when he died, but he, in order to pay for that video, they had to sell the VHS copy of it, and my parents rented it, and oh my God, I was running out of the room. They're like, let's watch it again. I'm like, let's go. It's like Michael Jackson. I mean, a kid running for Michael Jackson.
But it does feature Vincent Price, which is worth.
Well, and so I didn't appreciate it at the time, but since then I'm like, oh yeah, like the master of scary movies is, they got him to do, and it was his laugh that set me off. That was what.
That I understand.
So my last question for you, is, and I'm glad you brought up the classic rock component, because growing up, I feel like there was classic rock channels and then there's oldies channels. And oldies was like 50s, 60s.
Yep.
And then, and classic rock was 70s, 80s, and there was like now, there's oldies channels.
Yeah.
I'm listening to oldies channels, and like Billy Joel comes on, or Kiss.
Yeah.
They put Kiss on oldies.
Yeah.
I'm like, Kiss belongs on classic rock, if anything. Where does Bob Dylan fall in that? Is he an oldie or a classic?
I put him in the classic rock category myself. It's such a... It's so weird how these kind of categories pop up in general, though. I was thinking about this the other day, talking to some guys in my band about this. When I was a kid, there wasn't classic radio. When I was really young, it was pop radio and rock radio.
Right.
And then somewhere around the mid-'80s, classic rock became a thing. And at some point, someone had to make the decision, who makes the cut?
Right.
Like, who is classic rock and who
some
isn't?
DJ somewhere.
Right. And some big bands didn't make the cut. Like, for instance, the Mamas and the Papas, right, are one of the most influential bands of the 60s. They did the Monterey Pop Festival, for instance. They were the organizers of that. One of the most influential, when Jimi Hendrix burned his guitar, right?
Right.
It's indelible, right? They did not get included in the cut for classic rock.
Right. They're
oldies.
Stuck because they were a vocal group.
I guess.
I think it's the only
reasoning,
justification, but or maybe because of who they're related to, and some
I would think it's because you're right, because they're vocals and there's not screaming guitar or something. But yeah, I mean, nobody sold more albums in the '60s, and to just kind of cut them off and say, well, no, you're not in the classic rock. I never understood that.
So I guess almost like the status of these artists since their own time says a lot about. It's almost like a historiography kind of thing, where it's like the way we treat these artists in other generations and present day says a lot about what we consider what they accomplished and their own place in their own time.
Right.
It almost belittles them in a way to be like, yeah, they're the oldies.
No, definitely, because I mean, like I said, they sold hit records. They were so powerful in the industry. They put on the Monterey Pop Festival, one of the seminal music festivals like of all time.
Right.
But what's their legacy today? Like maybe you hear California Dreaming.
California Dreaming was like always, or
in a movie or something. But I mean, you don't hear anyone talking about them, and it's just weird how some bands kind of just the sands of time they just kind of go with them, and you don't hear about them.
I feel like I always think of Austin Powers when the first one, when he's going over all the 60s acts that died. He's like, Mama Cuss, ham sandwich,
Yes.
And in a way, the 90s is that's when like all this was organized.
Yeah.
Again, preparation for the millennium, and it was like, we're going to decide sort of the icons of each decade that came before us. And and Austin Powers isn't the only one. There's several movies in that era that did the same thing. Blast from the Past, Brendan Fraser gets stuck underground in the early 60s, and then comes up in the 90s and just sees how different the world is and all that. And
there's always a generation willing to look back. Like when I was in 10 or 11, it's late 70s, early 80s, and what was the big thing then was the 50s, right?
Yeah.
Grease was a big hit, and
Stray Cats
Happy Days, and all that kind of stuff. And I can even remember going to like school dances where they would play like At the Hop would be played every dance, and that didn't really make sense. It was a 25 or 30-year-old song at that point, but they would play it. And again, I think later on, the 90s started looking back into that.
We have such a muddled version of nostalgia now.
Yeah.
Because the 90s, when all that stuff happened, that's nostalgia now. Because that's 30 years ago, it was 1992.
Yep.
And so it's like, how can you, because the 90s were such a swirling mess of nostalgia itself and pop culture, that's probably why we get all mixed up now.
Yeah, and I think, would you agree? Like the '90s is kind of the what people are kind of nostalgic for nowadays.
Absolutely, it's I'm nostalgic for it, and I get very critical of programs, TV shows, movies that don't get it right.
Yeah,
because I'm like, I was there, we didn't talk every day about how great the 90s were.
Yeah.
Like, we just kind of lived our lives. But, maybe a little bit more than other people did.
Yeah.
Because we were preparing for the great, triple zeros that were coming ahead. But it's been great talking to you, Bob.
Same here.
You say you have a band. Do you want to plug the band?
Well, we are called Bigfoot Hideout. And,
that's a great name.
And I just moved up here, so we're brand new. But we are getting up a set list, and we'll be gigging soon. So I wish I could say that I had something to plug, but I really don't. So
it's all DIY. That's what I'm doing.
It's all DIY.
And I thank you, Bob, for joining the EPS podcast live.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Defiant
Thank
Records
you so much.
in Laconia.
Thank you.
These podcast shorts are the product of my live podcast karaoke events. If you're interested in hosting such a program, please contact the show at epspodcasthost@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, and be sure to tune in next time for more history through pop culture.